Is anybody out there? Anybody?
We are College Hill Farm. Welcome back to College Hill Farm. Well, today we are continuing our series on casual and complementary prepping, and we're asking the question, is hunting a viable prepping option in the case of an SHTF? Hunting has been a long tradition in Appalachia for years. Now, I, as a young man, spent plenty of time in the woods. I hunted deer, turkeys, fox, raccoons, possums, muskrat. Okay, the list goes on and on. I've fished all over eastern Kentucky and hunted from Harlan County to Moorhead to Lancaster to Somerset. I have been all over the state hunting and fishing. So I've spent a lot of time in the woods. I've spent a lot of time with wildlife. Also, that includes dressing them. We never used a processor to dress our wildlife. We prepared them ourselves. You know, skinned a coon or a possum, or I skinned stuff. I used to trap, and I skinned stuff for meat and for skins. Some things just skins. Everything from coyote to otter to mink. Not otter. I never saw an otter till the wild, till just lately. But mink, weasels. You know, we skinned out all that stuff, saved the hides, and sold them. So I know a lot about hunting as a way of obtaining food. So for this video, I am going to try and contain it to Kentucky, somewhere I know. Most hunters are local hunters. So I'm going to try and contain things to Kentucky, because I know Kentucky really well. I've hunted here. Eastern Kentucky, where I was born and raised. For a short stint, we spent some time in Michigan because jobs were so bad, but for the most part, I was born and raised in Eastern Kentucky. Stayed in the mountains as a young fella. The mountains are a wonderful thing in Eastern Kentucky. Most of the mountains there are owned by absentee landowners, meaning coal corporations and gas corporations who own the land, but don't do anything with it. They let it sit fallow, because what's going on is they need to wait until the coal or gas is economically feasible enough, the prices are high enough, for them to harvest it. So they sit on large tracts. Maybe in my home county, 80% of the land is owned by absentee landowners. So they didn't worry about anybody going up there and fishing or hunting or anything like that. They let it grow up in native hardwoods, and the trees and stuff provide excellent cover for all the squirrels and the groundhogs and the rabbits and the raccoons and the deer and the possums. And okay, so it's great hunting habitat. So that was what I was raised doing, roaming those mountains and harvesting game. Now, every year, the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife do surveys, and they determine how many deer are in Kentucky. Now, they do for the whole state. They estimate for each county, but they keep running estimates of how many deer are harvested. They estimate that Kentucky has an active deer population of about 1 million deer. And I'm going to do deer because deer is the largest animal. We have some elk in Kentucky, but there are so few of them that they would be gone in the first week. So we're not going to talk about elk. We're going to talk about deer to begin with. So every year, Kentucky does a log, and in 2022 there were 144,514 deer harvested. Now, that's males, females, button bucks, little deer, big deer, okay? The average weight of those deers yielded about 107.56 pounds. That's the average deer weight of all the ones harvested, about 107 pounds. Now, I know you say, well, you know, I've killed 200-pound deer. Yeah, you probably have, but when you start looking at the entire deer population, we're talking about big ones, little ones, everything in between. We're talking about 107 pounds is the average deer weight. So now, when you process a 107-pound deer, you're only going to get about 52 pounds worth of usable meat. Now, of that 52 pounds of meat, each 52 pounds is about 715 calories. So if we harvested all the deer in Kentucky, all million of them, if we harvested them all, that would be, well, each deer is about 36,500 calories. 52 pounds times 715 is 36,500 calories. So if we harvested all of them, that would be about 36.5 billion calories worth of deer in the state of Kentucky. Now, Kentucky has a population of about 4.5 million people. Now, that's a lot, but let's say something happened and all the urban areas were gone. Who knows what happened? All the people in urban areas disappeared. Nobody wants to have an urban area hunter in their backyard, okay? Just saying. So, if the urban areas disappeared, we still got 1,035,000 people who live in rural counties in Kentucky. Now, most of these people have never hunted, but some of them have, and a lot of them may have hunted before, but hunting has not been the #1 source of food for a long time in Kentucky, so most of those people haven't hunted, but they still have to be fed, so we're going to consider that. Now, in 30 days, an average person does 2,000 calories a day is required for them not to lose weight. In other words, to maintain your weight, the average person is 2,000 calories per day. Now, that's an inactive person, okay? An inactive person. A very active person may need a lot more. The U.S. military, for example, the average full-day MRE is about 3,700 calories. Some are 3,600, some are 3,800. Just depends. So they have about 3,800 calories for those active folks. But for our purposes, we're going to stick with the 2,000 calorie thing, because part of these folks are kids, women who don't weigh as much as men and may not be as active, and some men who are just can't be active, some old folks, and okay, you see what I'm saying? So we're going to stick with the 2,000 calorie a day number, and that will make the math easier too. So let's stick with that. So 30 days in a month, so each person needs 30 times 2,000, which winds up being 60,000 calories a month. Each person. Well, if you look at the number of rural people there are, and I'm just going to say 1 million instead of 1,035,000. I'm just going to say 1 million. 1 million rural people, that's 60 billion calories. Well, the entire deer population of Kentucky can only provide 36.5 billion calories. So you're looking at a pretty good deficit. Okay? 60 billion is what's needed. 36.5 is all you got. So you would have to rely on other animals. Of course, you're going to be hunting, you're going to be gathering too, but in the winter months, there's not much to gather. Okay? In the summer months, there's roots and berries and things like that you can gather, but in the winter months, there's not much. So most of your diet is going to consist of meats and dried meats in a hunter-gatherer type situation. So we've got a huge deficit. Well, where does that deficit, would it come from? Well, it could come from other small game. Now, I know some of you are going to say, well, in a SHTF, a lot of the population is going to disappear. But let's say we've got 4.5 million people in Kentucky, And we have an SHTF that 75% of the people in Kentucky died off, or just disappeared for whatever reason. You know, whatever reason, 75% of the population disappeared. There would still be 1.2 million people in Kentucky. Okay? We're still talking about feeding 1 million people. So let's look at what other small game can do for us. And I'm just going to do a few. You can extrapolate from others. You know, possum is going to be about like a coon and a okay. So a raccoon. Your average raccoon is going to dress out at about 8 to 10 pounds. I've eaten a lot of them. I love raccoon stew. Raccoon stew is the best beef stew you ever laid your mouth on. It's greasy and it's just good. Anyway, the average raccoon is 8 to 10 pounds and will yield about 7,812 calories. A bass. You're going to go fish. A bass. A bass will yield about 470 calories per pound. Think about how many bass you've caught that you got a pound of meat out of. Crawdad tails, one of my favorites. We have traps. We set traps and harvest crawdads all the time. A pound of crawdad tails is only 270 calories. And that, I'm talking about peeled and deveined. You take the mud vein out and you peel them and just have the tail meat. A pound of that is 270 calories. A squirrel. Average squirrel yields about 8 ounces, 7 to 8 ounces of meat and is worth about 210 calories. And a Canadian goose. Now, I've never hunted waterfowl. I've raised waterfowl and I've eaten waterfowl, but I've never hunted waterfowl. So waterfowl, a Canadian goose, the average is going to yield about 8 pounds of meat and 3,624 calories. And you can figure out the others from there. There are plenty more. Populations on the verge around the world eat things that us Americans we wouldn't consider. They eat things like dog and coyote and blackbirds and other birds. My granddad talked about eating red-headed woodpeckers and speckled birds. Of course, I eat grouse and quail. There are all kinds of things, lizards and snakes, that people on the verge will eat. But let's look at hunting in a historical context. You know, they talk about hunter-gatherers and everybody points to the Native Americans. And let's talk about that and how historically it went for them. Now, in Kentucky, and again, I'm closing everything down to Kentucky, somewhere that I know in particular. Other states are different. Arizona not going to have as many animals per square mile. Okay, Montana might have more. All right, so there's these differences, these variances. But I'm going to stick with what I know because that's the way one of these talks ought to be. It ought to be on things you know, not on things you think or things you guess about. So it's about things I know. About 1,000 years ago, well, before that, hunter-gatherers roamed through Kentucky following the buffalo and following other animals, and they hunted and gathered, and scientists and anthropologists think that in order for a hunter-gatherer to be sustainable on a piece of property, that hunter-gatherer has to have a piece of property of 4,000 acres for each individual in the group. So a group of 4, just a family of 4, would need 16,000 acres to roam across in order to eat and survive as a hunter-gatherer. So hunter-gatherers in Kentucky, if we think about them, Kentucky had has 25.8 million acres. So if we divide that up by 4,000, then we find out that only about 6,450 people could sustainably live in Kentucky in a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. 6,450 people. Okay? That's it. So, 1,000 years before Christ, 1000 BCE, most of the hunter-gatherers in Kentucky had settled down to a farming type lifestyle. I know. Daniel Boone on Fess Parker's been Daniel Boone ever since I was a kid, and he'll be Daniel Boone till I die, as far as I'm concerned. But they never showed you that the Shawnees and the Cherokee and the Delaware and the Wyandot and the other Native Americans that were living here were actually farming communities. They got most of their sustenance from what they raised. Almost all hunter-gatherer societies found out that they could raise their crops and do a lot better. They sustainably hunted, still hunted the buffalo, and they still hunted deer, and they still hunted other things, but they did it sustainably. But their main source of food came from the crops they grew. You never saw that. They were always warriors on the old TV shows. That's a misconception. Don't fall for it. About 1774, the first fort was built in Kentucky, and settlers started streaming into the state. Now, for that first year, those settlers, they were on dying times. They were starving times. Because by the time the second set of settlers got here, all the game had been hunted out. The deer were gone, the possums, the coons, the squirrels, everything was gone. Okay, it's as part of the historical record. They call it the starving time. When they first got to the fort, they had the food that they brought with them. And then when they moved out onto their little homestead, until they could get their crops in the ground cleared and their crops in the ground, they could only eat what they brought with them, what they left hundreds of miles away and went hunted, or what they grew or bought. So they either had to have a stock of money with them, which money was hard to come by back then, so they called it the starving time, when they were really rationed strictly on the amount of food that they had. So even back in 1774, when they were still using flintlocks, the game was gone relatively quickly. So hunting is just not a viable strategy for preppers. Hunting is not a viable strategy for preppers. Within the first month or two, the game's going to be gone in a local area. Okay? It's just the way it's going to be. The game's going to be gone. Everybody that can hunt's going to be out there hunting. There won't be anything. Within a month or two, the folks who have decided that hunting was their number one strategy, they'll be desperate. They may not know how to plant a garden. Gardening is a learned activity, and the learning curve is pretty steep. Now, some of the old farmers will be able to do just fine, but some of the folks that live in the mini metropolitan areas and in the urban areas, they will have no idea about how to garden and have never raised so much as a turnip. So they won't have a clue. So they'll be desperate within short order. And desperate people are dangerous. Let me say that again. Desperate people are dangerous. This country boy can survive thing, where we can run a trot line and we can fish and we can hunt and that's all we got to have, that's a recipe for disaster. It's a recipe for disaster to the rest of the prepping community, because when desperate people are hungry, they do desperate things and they're well armed. Okay? So think about that when you think about how to prep. Prep for the garden, prep for your supplies, prep for the other stuff. Who knows what's going to come down the line? Now, prepping is one of those things that it's a common sense activity. 99% of the time, you're prepping for getting laid off from your job. You're prepping for an illness. What if you get sick and can't work? You're prepping for common sense, everyday things, loss of income. Okay, you get laid off at the mill, and you can't get a job back that paid as much, so you got to take a lower paying job. So you have to raise that garden to help with your food bill. That's the common sense parts of prepping. But then there are the other parts of prepping, and I'll leave that up to you to think about how you're going to prepare for that. But commonsensical prepping is the number one reason to prep, not these extreme SHTFs that I sometimes talk about here on the channel. Now, if you like this stuff, this homesteading, do-it-yourself kind of thing, be certain to come on out to the channel and subscribe. We do this homesteading, prepping stuff all the time, sometimes one, sometimes 5 videos. Just depends on what's going on in the homestead. Now, when you get there, if you hit the little bell, it'll notify you when we upload a video. We upload every Sunday. Now, with that being said, it's time for me to get on to the next thing.